Hello, welcome back to another AP United States History video essay on Reagan's presidency and specifically the effect of Reaganomics. So without further ado, let's get our brain cows milked. Leading up to Reagan's presidency, there was a steep decline in trust of the American government due to the constant lies and general misinformation about Cold War military conflicts that were brought to light, such as the Pentagon Files and Watergate. Not only were people less confident in their own government, but there was a looming threat of Russia, with tensions and paranoia from the Cold War at an all-time high. Finally, stagflation, a term used to describe unemployment and inflation going up at the same time, was at its peak in the 1970s.
All of these factors led up to Ronald Reagan taking office, running on a campaign platform of limited government, deregulation, lower taxes, and a harsher attitude towards Russia. However, although Reaganomics had some positive short-term effects, such as lowering unemployment and inflation from 1983 to 1988, the government's deregulation of the economy and decreased spending in essential social services had a severely negative impact on American society in the long term, resulting in the growth of the economic inequalities between the upper and lower class. The Reagan administration did have some positive effects on the United States, mostly in the short term, such as lowering unemployment and inflation for a time, and also increasing American morale. But these small short-term effects came at a great cost and were often unhelpful for many Americans. For example, according to M.V. Naidu, Reagan and many conservatives at the time thought that reductions in deficits of national government and in taxes on big business would boost productivity, thereby creating jobs. While this was true to some extent, allowing corporations this much freedom caused them to exploit their workers more, specifically the ones most economically vulnerable. Some may argue that Reagan saved the United States large amounts of money by cutting social services, about $22 billion at the time. But in actuality, he drastically increased federal spending, with the national debt nearly tripling to $2.1 trillion. The administration's ambitious military buildup, which included projects such as the failed Star Wars program, was fueled by an ideology that prioritized military dominance over fiscal responsibility. This diverted funds that could have been used on social services or public infrastructure. Instead, because of this excessive spending, Reagan widened the wealth gap and deepened socioeconomic inequalities. For a nation, it is crucial to balance military strength with the allocation of resources to vital social benefits in order to ensure that military spending does not come at the cost of a nation's people and well-being.
The Reagan administration also greatly promoted the deregulation of industries, with the intention of promoting laissez-faire competition and more efficiency, but these changes ultimately led to the weakening of unions and workers' rights, disproportionately impacting lower-income workers. As many policies and tax cuts favored corporations, stagnant wages and harsher treatment of workers increased. Not only this, but anti-union policies and lower union membership significantly weakened the voice of workers. Reagan not only suffocated unions indirectly, but also explicitly, with Howell and Kalberg saying, President Reagan fired 11,400 air traffic controllers in 1981, led to the increasing use of permanent replacement workers in strikes. Employers suddenly became more willing to use or threaten to use permanent replacements when workers went on strike. This mass firing of workers and immediate replacement of them discouraged unions from striking and gave corporations an even more unfair power over their employees. The growing gap between wages and actual production yield unjustly rewarded businesses and corporate executives with millions of dollars, while the employees actually working could hardly keep themselves afloat as the economic standing of their households vastly worsened.
Furthermore, Reagan's implementation of significant tax cuts for extremely wealthy corporations and individuals was meant to be a way for trickle-down economics to benefit all classes. However, these benefits were not equally distributed, as those from the lower and middle class saw very little to no improvement, while those of higher class had an exponential increase in wealth. Although overall the economy did improve, the benefits of this rejuvenated economy only benefited the wealthy in practice, with Howell and Kalberg articulating, although the economy grew by 77% from 1980 and 2014, the average market income of the bottom 50 actually fell by 6.2%. This caused an even greater chasm between the rich and the middle to lower class. This exacerbation of a wealth gap crippled social mobility and encouraged a system that favored the extremely wealthy. As Robert Reich and Felix Rohatyn correctly predicted at the beginning of Reagan's presidency, the poor already suffering from Reagan's policies will be hit harder than during the last recession, as will the middle class. Consistently throughout the Reagan era, poor Americans were sidelined as though they did not exist, while the wealthy few, the only real beneficiaries of Reaganomics, remained the federal government's central focus.
Reagan's erasure of essential social services impaired those who were most vulnerable, and had the effect of portraying poverty as a failure of effort, misrepresenting social welfare as a way for criminals and so-called lazy Americans to take advantage of hardworking upper-class families. This way of thinking shifted the entire way Americans thought of government, as the government perceived to be overly involved in the economy became a malicious entity that gave too much help to citizens and turned them into weak and dependent in the process. Reagan was able to sell the idea that assistance for the poor was bad for the American people, as it was, in his mind, their own fault that they were poor, releasing an aura of blame into American society as a whole. As Heckler outlined, since they have fallen into that shrinking share of the federal budget known as non-entitlement discretionary as domestic spending, Great Society anti-poverty programs have continually been trimmed down. As the name suggests, discretionary spending entails spending essentials such as food and rent, which were now being cut from the budget, and thus cut from the lives of many poorer Americans because they were not, quote, entitled to these for a living. This characterization of welfare and the poor allowed Reagan to weaponize the middle and lower classes against one another, a conflict that has endured to the present day. The inequalities of the Reagan era will continue to have an effect for decades to come, so we must remember his mistakes and strive to create a government that remembers its proper mission, to be for the people, not against them.